We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald. With me today, Mark Fallon. Mark Fallon government service spans more than 3 decades, including serving as the Naval Criminal Investigation Service, Deputy Assistant Director for Counterterrorism, the NCIS Chief of Counterintelligence Operations for the Europe, African, and Middle East Division, and as a Senior Executive in the Department of Homeland Security, as the Assistant Director for Training of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And following the attacks of September 11th, Mark was the Deputy Commander of the military task force established to bring terrorists to justice before military commissions in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. He previously served as the NCIS Commander of the USS Cole task force, overseeing the investigation of the terrorist attack on the ship in Aden, Yemen, and also worked on the investigation and prosecution of the Blind Sheik, Sheik Omar Abdel-Rahman. He is the author of Unjustifiable Means, the inside story of how the CIA, Pentagon, and U.S. government conspired to torture, and a contributing author and co-editor of Interrogation and Torture, Integrating Efficacy with Law and Morality. Mark, thank you very much for coming on today.
Pleasure to be with you, Adam.
Sure. Let's go right to the beginning. In the beginning of the book, actually, you stated you were the tactical commander of the USS Cole bombing investigation. Could you elaborate more how you became involved in this case?
Yeah, sure, Adam. At the time of the Cole attack, I was the NCIS Chief of Counterintelligence Operations for Europe, Africa, and the Middle East Division. And so my responsibility was primarily threat warnings. And that's in, if you're familiar with the military, that's the 5th and 6th Fleet area of responsibility. And really my jurisdiction spanned from Iceland all the way down through the Middle East. And so the USS Cole, for lack of a better term, was attacked on my watch. And so when we decided kind of how to investigate it, the director of NCIS made the decision that we were going to assume control of the investigation in Washington, D.C. at headquarters rather than in the field, because in the field they were overwhelmed with other issues and other threat warnings. So the director, Dave Brandt, thought that the investigation ought to be run out of Washington. And I worked very closely with my counterpart from the FBI, John O'Neill, at the New York division at the time, and FBI headquarters at the time. And so that's, I was once asked how I got involved in all these terrorist cases, and it's because things blew up on my watch.
It was an interesting case about the USS Cole bombing because there was a previous terrorist incident that never came to partly came to fruition, that wanted to attack the USS Sullivan's. And this is the Millennium bombing plot, where incidentally the USS Sullivan's was actually going to be the initial ship that was going to be bombed. But instead, the USS Cole was actually bombed in the port of Aden. Yemen itself seems to be a hotbed for Al-Qaeda as well. And I think the captain of the ship of the USS Cole, his name escapes me.
Kurt Leopold.
Thank you very much. That's right, Kurt Leopold. He actually complained about a lack of security around the ship itself. Was this a problem regarding assistance to U.S. investigators regarding him? Because I noticed even after the bombing of USS Cole, John O'Neill ran into problems with Barbara Bodine, the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Yemen. So, I mean, there was intelligence regarding terrorists in Yemen that wanted to attack U.S. ships. Was this known to you at the time, or?
Yeah, actually, and of course, Yemen is the ancestral homeland of Osama bin Laden.
Right.
And so there was a lot of connections there, and you'll see a lot of traffic go through Yemen over the years. Adam, we actually had during the NSA warnings, and this has been declassified as part of the USS Cole Commission report. We actually had intelligence about potential small boat attacks. And it was actually in the 6th Fleet AOR, which is before the ship transited the Suez Canal. Once the ship goes in the Suez Canal, it becomes the 5th Fleet, Naval Central Command, rather than Naval Europe Command, which is 6th Fleet. And so we had threat warnings, and actually we sent agents on board the ship while it was still in the 6th Fleet area responsibility to ensure that that intelligence was passed to the ship. One of the problems that the USS Cole Commission, not the investigation, not the task force, the criminal investigation, but the commission report that looked at the overall process and what the failings were, and I've testified before Congress about this, is that normally for a ship visit, an NCIS team would go advance a port, deal with the country team. They may have assets on the ground there, and then try to get an updated threat picture so a decision could be made whether a ship goes into a port or not. The fact that the Yemen had a fuel dolphin that wasn't a traditional port visit did not trigger or enact those type of mechanisms. And so, we don't know, of course, whether that attack could have been prevented. However, we do know that the USS Sullivan's was not attacked because a small boat got stuck in the tide and got overwhelmed by water. And had agents been on the ground, that type of activity could have possibly been passed along because they discovered the explosives with Cyrillic writing on it. Actually, when Al Qaeda, the suicide bombers fled, it was Eid al-Fitr. Local Yemenis thought they got a gift from God, from Allah, and then Al Qaeda had to come back and buy the explosives back from them, and they dried them out. They did a very good job because they found another area to launch the boats in. They did trial runs to make sure that they did it. So from an operational perspective, they learned from their mistakes, and we lost 17 sailors on the 12th of November, 2000.
And just before that as well, this is something that was unknown to me till I started reading up on your profile, was that you also, just years prior, had prosecuted Omar Abdel-Rahman, the Blind Sheik, from an Egyptian radical sect called the Gamma Islamiyah. And he was involved at some level with the 1983 World Trade Center bombing, as well as the Landmarks bombing plot here in New York City. How did you become involved in that case? Yeah,
well, the Blind Sheik was the spiritual advisor to Osama bin Laden. And it's interesting, as you know, I take a hard line against torture. I think it's an act of cowardice to start with, and it's nothing any professional would engage in. But what's interesting here, Adam, is that after Anwar Sadat was assassinated in Egypt, when they rounded up all the usual suspects and brought them into prison and tortured them, among those that was picked up was the Blind Sheik Omar Abdel-Rahman, as well as Ayman al-Zawahiri, who then later went on to form Al-Qaeda with Osama bin Laden. So that those acts of torture in prison, the family of interrogational abuses that the Egyptians and other dictators use, and that the U.S. resorted to after 9/11, in my view, helped further radicalize people to fight against the United States. And so with the Blind Sheik, and then, you know, it was the landmarks plot is we called it Stop, is the code name, Stop Terrorism. Is it? And we had an NCIS asset, counterintelligence informant or asset, who was able to penetrate the Blind Sheik and his group of cohorts, eventually selling cannon fuses and remote control igniters and other things, planned some training that the FBI never went through on, but had we been able to conduct some training, we may have been able to identify a lot of the plotters prior to the landmarks and the first World Trade Center attack. But we never did go through with some of the training, and we were eventually, of course, attacked with a truck bomb underneath the World Trade Center, and fortunately, it didn't result in toppling the towers, which was their goal at that time.
Had you managed to meet with Rahman itself or himself, or no?
No, I did not. No, not at all. I mean, we had assets that we worked to infiltrate. There was a lot of activity at the Al-Kifah Refugee Center in New York City, the Al Farouk Mosque.
Right.
And so our asset, Garrett Wilson, it's declassified. He testified against the Blind Sheik, Southern District of New York. So I can tell you about that. Many of our assets I cannot talk about. Right. They're still classified, but I can talk about Garrett. Yeah, he was dealing with Sadiq Ibrahim, Sadiq Ali, and all of those involved in the landmarks plot. They wanted to blow up the Holland Lincoln tunnels. 26 Federal Plaza was the federal building. The United Nations, they wanted to assassinate Hosni Mubarak when he was visiting the United Nations. So it was a sophisticated plot, and we were able to actually arrest them as they were mixing the explosives. We were able to have video coverage inside where the warehouse where they're mixing the explosives they're going to use in attacks. And that's when the FBI, NYPD, Joint Terrorism Task Force swooped in, arrested everyone. And after Garrett, the NCIS asset, testified against the Sheik, he went into the Federal Witness Protection Program for his safety.
You know, just to follow up on that, there was also another informant, Imad Salem, who was a former Egyptian officer who worked as an informant for the New York City FBI and infiltrated the Al Farouk Mosque, became Rahman's personal bodyguard. But there was a story that he actually went to visit El Said Nosser in prison, who, by the way, wasn't found guilty for the assassination of Mayor Khan, but found guilty on a gun charge.
Yep.
And that they spoke about, El Said Nosser told Imad Salem whether he knew how to build bombs. Was the idea for the landmarks plot originated from El Said Nosser and that visit to prison?
I don't think it was originated there. I think this was something that was in the planning for a while, and that may have just been coincidental.
Yeah, by the way, there was also a story, because I live in New York. I remember the story that there was I always forget the guy's name. It's some radical fundamentalist that was on either the Brooklyn Bridge or George Washington Bridge that shot up a school full of Jewish children on a bus. I wish I knew that story more. I remember that incident and whatnot, but they arrested him, and I can't remember the guy's name, and there goes that question I have for you. But okay, 9/11 happens. United States military and intelligence apparatuses are in overdrive. Information is awash everywhere in every station.
We were on overdrive that entire summer, Adam. The system was blinking red.
Right. The system. Well, according to Lieutenant, yes, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
We anticipated that some attack would occur because there was just so much activity going on from the intelligence platforms. It was just trying to determine the where or when, but it seemed pretty likely that there was going to be some attack. Never did we envision something of the magnitude of certainly the 9/11 attacks, but certainly there was intelligence out there. And as in, you know, we know that from the presidential briefings that President Bush had, you know, just months before September 11th about, you know, possible plane attacks. And actually, if you read down that warning, it talks about releasing the Sheik Omar Abdel-Rahman.
That's right.
That was some of the demands that that they heard were going to be made. So you can see the core of this goes all the way back to Rahman and Zawahiri and even before Bin Laden.
Right, and you know what? You bring up a good point here, and I want to expound on it now. Throughout the late 1990s, I mean, I just did a video about the, I just did a podcast actually about the Luxor massacre in 1997, where there was a leaflet placed in one of the victims' mouths about the release of Omar Abdel-Rahman. But yes, I mean, Bin Laden's statements actually talk about Rahman and his release, enforcing his release from prison itself, and heightened tensions regarding terrorist incidents throughout the late 1990s.
And Adam, let me tell you why that was so important. Sure. Because Rahman had religious chops. Okay, so he could issue fatwas. You know, he sanctioned the first World Trade Center attack and the landmark, potential attacks. And so he gives Al-Qaeda legitimacy because of his religious connections, right? And that's something that Bin Laden didn't have, Zawahiri didn't have. And so you for the fatwas, for it to be this religious war, you need someone with religious credibility. And that's one of the things that Rahman brought to the table.
Right, because Bin Laden was not authorized to issue fatwas because he was not religiously literate, really. I mean, he was not an imam of any sorts. In the, this is a big part of the book that I had not known about and I've learned from, is that, and I think this is really an important issue you raise in the book, is that there was a high-level meeting in Wynwood, Connecticut, I believe, led by Martin Seligman, the Robert A. Fox Leadership Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and that there were other distinguished attendees such as James Mitchell, who we'll later talk about, and other names that you couldn't, these names were redacted actually, from the FBI's Behavioral Science Analysis Unit. Tell us why this meeting was so important.
Yeah, well, this is important, and actually it was not Connecticut, it was in Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. It was right here in a Philadelphia suburb. Right. And right now I am the interim executive director of the Center for Ethics and Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, where Seligman still works, is connected with. And,
wow.
Yeah, this was a critical meeting because if you look at the manner in which, and the CIA over the years had always kind of dabbled with coercion up to including in torture.
Right.
Okay, if you look back at the MK Ultra kind of experiments, back down through the Cuba Counterintelligence Manual, down through Project X in Vietnam, the HRE. At one point, the term interrogation within the CIA had a bad name because they kept killing people during interrogation. So they said, we can't use that word anymore. We're going to call it human resource exploitation. So then they called it the HRE program. And every time they dabbled in this, they wound up killing somebody, and Congress would get involved. No one would be held accountable. They say they'd never do it again. And then guess what happens? They do it again. And this is what happened after 9/11 as well. So what they were utilizing was the same methodologies that the communists and North Koreans used to get false confessions from our service members. And so there was a study by a guy named Albert Bitterman, who worked for the Air Force, a research scientist, and because they wanted to know why our servicemen were giving false confessions. And so what Bitterman determined was that the manner in which the North Koreans, with the guidance of the Chinese and the Russians, what they would do is they would create what they called the triple Ds, the debility, dependency, and dread. And so this is what the CIA was applying, and later the Department of Defense was applying to the Al-Qaeda suspects. But it was based on what we call SEER, survive, evade, resist, and escape. And this is a program where, in limited doses by military members, who it's a role-playing exercise, would capture our service members in an exercise, and they would subject them to, in a small dosage, the type of interrogation tactics, the coercion, brutality, and torture type methods that a brutal adversary would use against us if they were not adhering to the Geneva Conventions. And so this involved a number of things. What Seligman had beyond that were these tests on dogs. And so Seligman would shock a dog, and what they found was that the dog would no longer try to avoid the shock, right? So it would learn to be helpless, right? So it's called learned helplessness. And so when this is the additive, this is what eventually the only other element outside of the normal SEER type techniques that in theory Mitchell and Jesse were applying was this theory of learned helplessness, where the person, if you treated them like that animal, would learn to be helpless. And if you look at over the years, and you mentioned earlier before we were on about Maria Hartwig at John Jay, we wrote about this a few times. And if you look at kind of the history, it goes back to this, version of the Manchurian Candidate. You're trying to break the person down to an infantile state with the thought that you would have an obedient person. And this is the problem. This is what they didn't understand as there's a difference between being compliant and being cooperative, right? Cooperation is volitional, right? I have to want to cooperate. You can make me comply, but you can't make me cooperate, right? That, you can make me do things. And so that's why that meeting was so critical, because what happened was in the meeting was the person from the CIA who brought Jim Mitchell into the CIA, who later went to work for Mitchell after Mitchell was awarded a multi-million-dollar contract. Right. And he was awarded a contract not for inventing anything new, just for re-establishing the existing program that the CIA had used. Okay, the only difference between what they were using before and this was really, this theory of learned helplessness. Right. And so I did a talk earlier this month with Kathy Scott Clark, who wrote the book The Forever Prisoner. Excellent book. Highly recommended, because in the book, Kathy writes about things that I cannot talk about. Okay, and so what Kathy told me when I interviewed her at Georgetown Law earlier this month was that a lawyer from the CIA Counterterrorism Center was the one who brought Mitchell into the CIA Counterterrorism Center to do those, I don't even like to call them interrogations, to do torture. Yeah. They call it the EIT, Enhanced Interrogation Techniques. They just made that word up. EIT is nothing more than an excuse to inflict torture. Right. That's what it was. But what Kathy revealed was that this lawyer's wife was a psychologist with the CIA in the Counterterrorism Center. I was the one who vouched for and recommended Mitchell And then the lawyer helped get Mitchell into his contract into the Counterterrorism Center. And then that lawyer's wife also went to work for Mitchell.
Oh.
And so what you could see is what the CIA wound up doing was just taking this program that had become dormant, where they were already applying these similar type techniques, paid Mitchell and Jessen millions of dollars to restore it, because a lot of the people over the years who were doing that before had retired, had gone on. So their cadre of torturers had been depleted over the years because they had stopped doing it for a while. And so Mitchell and Jessen were brought in to reestablish this program and then train other people in the SEER techniques. And the same people, and the people that trained them were from what's called the JPRA, Joint Personnel Recovery Agency, which is the people who do the SEER training. That's the DoD component who oversees the SEER program. The same instructors who train the CIA train the military personnel at Fort Bragg that were at Gitmo. And so what you saw was a lot of people think there were these two different torture programs. It was really just one large, established governmental torture program that was applied differently by different agencies. So the CIA did it differently than the Department of Defense did. But the theory and practice was the same. That same CIA lawyer came to Guantanamo and told the military how they were doing the SEER program within the CIA, and they used that as justification to get the authorization to do it within the Department of Defense.
There's I've been posting redacted files from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence regarding this program, and one consistent finding that I've been noticing and learning is that a lot of these people that have been from the CIA itself at Camp Green or Site Blue and X-Ray, was that these were young men with no experience even in the torture program itself. So there was a lot of these young men that were Now, why would they employ these non-experienced people to extract information from high-profile terrorists?
Yeah, Adam, and this is really what the problem is. Obviously, rather than turning to interrogation professionals,
right?
People who have done interrogations before, or done terrorist interrogations before. The I-49 squad of the FBI NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York City, NCIS personnel who were involved in the Cole and other terrorist cases could have been turned to. The CIA could have gone to them to ask how we should do this. They turned to Mitchell and Jessen, who had no interrogation experience, had no Middle East experience, had no Al-Qaeda experience. And what your listeners ought to realize is they were psychologists in the SEER program. They were not instructors in the SEER program. Their job was to monitor the students to ensure that if they got too emotionally distraught, to get them out of that with their psychologist training, and also to ensure that drift doesn't occur. Drift is where a soldier role player would try to go, if they were walling somebody, would wall them harder, and they would drift beyond the parameters. And at the time, the only service that was doing waterboarding was the Navy, and they stopped doing waterboarding because they found that the SEALs capitulated, right? That they gave in. And the purpose of the SEER training program within the military was to instill some confidence, to let you know that you'd be able to get through this. And so what they found was the waterboard, that they weren't going to get through this because it is a mock execution. Your body reacts as if you are drowning. And with Abu Zubaydah, it was a drowning, right? And with others, they may have been drowned as well. And so Zubaydah had to be brought back to life. And so this is the real shame of it, and the fact that no one was held accountable, that even from a decision-making process, that at the senior levels of the government, a decision was made to not go to interrogation professionals, but to turn to psychologists and to then employ methodologies that were known to produce false confessions. And so when people read my book, Unjustifiable Means, when they're done with it, some of them ask themselves the question that I would hope they would: if we knew that they were the type of seer techniques produce false confessions, is that why they applied it to start with? Right. And
Mark,
so that's the question that needs to be answered. And that's why you might not turn to an agency like NCIS, to do this, or the FBI, because they may operate with more integrity than that. Unfortunately, what we've learned from the hearings at Guantanamo is that FBI agents were detailed to the CIA, and the FBI was involved in the torture program, as shameful as that is to our nation.
I can't tell you how many times I said that, even after reading your book and interviewing people like Ken Williams of the Phoenix Memo in Arizona, where I tell them, I said, when they waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 183 times, I said to myself, was it basically just to get information, or was it to coerce false confessions? Because you don't know what is true and what is false at this point. And
exactly.
I asked Ken Williams this, and I'll ask you, is that the reason why we haven't had a trial yet in 21 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the government has shrouded anything related to torture or torture accountability or about torture advocates under this cloak of invisibility, right? I wrote a piece for Spy Talk called State-Sponsored Secrets, about state-sponsored secrets and the blinding of justice, right? And so for me, when I write, the Supreme Court has refused to hear our writ of certiorari, where we are challenging what we believe is an abridgment of our constitutional right, our First Amendment right to free speech, because everything I write has to be subjected to a pre-publication review. I currently have a document that I'm challenging from pre-publication review because it was information that was in the public domain, and it was information that members of the Supreme Court had said, but the government had determined that I was unable to say the same thing Supreme Court justices had said. Same thing with my book. Things that were part of congressional hearings were redacted. Things that were in the media were redacted. And the government's position was, when we tried to talk to them, personally, I was represented by the ACLU and Knight's First Amendment Institute, was that if I say it, it has more credibility because I was there and in the know. And so the government's position is then they can redact, my memory and my ability to speak out against, and not classified, Adam. I would never tell you anything classified. Right. I mean, I'm read into programs. That obligation is lifelong. I understand that. I didn't go to the press with any of this stuff. I fought from the inside, right? I was trying to stop a crime in progress, right? I was trying to stop the government from committing a war crime on the inside, using my chains of command, using everything in my power to try to stop it. But at some point, maybe one day, somebody will be held accountable. And here's why it's critically important. Right now, today, where there are war crimes being committed by Russians, right, in Ukraine, and the Office of the Chief Prosecutor in Ukraine wants to bring them to justice. And he talks about Yuri Belosov, who's a friend of mine, who's the chief prosecutor for war crimes, talks about learning lessons from Guantanamo. We cannot do that. We cannot go down the road the U.S. went down, because 20 years after 9/11 and the Cole attack, we have still not brought those perpetrators to justice. They are still stuck in motion hearings about torture, who tortured, how much they were tortured, what could be disclosed about torture. And there are other people at Guantanamo in indefinite detention without trial from a country that was founded upon basic inalienable human rights. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is shameful conduct, but so from a geopolitical perspective, what type of credibility do we have when we still have people at Guantanamo who've not been brought to trial, and we still have people in indefinite detention without trial when we're trying to school the world and school Russia about what activities that they should be engaged in? And so this is the problem when we went down that deep, dark abyss and decided to utilize torture as an instrument of national policy, which is what we did.
So you were actually given authority to set up the Criminal Investigation Task Force to investigate Al-Qaeda suspects at Guantanamo Bay Prison. What was the operational function of the Criminal Investigation Task Force?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit more about that. And a lot of people think it's at Guantanamo. Guantanamo was the prison. I mean, the task force was headquartered in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. We had operational units in Guantanamo, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. Okay. We had global jurisdiction. So our jurisdiction was to investigate, bring to justice before military commissions anyone who is or was a member of Al-Qaeda, anyone who aided, abetted, or knowingly harbored the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. That order was issued by President George Bush on November 13th, 2001, went to the Secretary of Defense and wound up in my lap. I was detailed to the Department of the Army to work for Army CID, reporting directly to the Office of General Counsel, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, to establish a task force. Now, what's interesting about this, Adam, it was a mission that I did not think I should have had. Yeah. Right? It was a mission I do not think that the Department of Defense should have had. I think that was bad judgment on the president's part, not giving that mission to the FBI. However, that was a lawful order. Okay, under the Article 2 authority of the president, he can hold military commissions, right? And so while I disagreed with that order, it was my job to implement that order, right? When the order came down to torture, I viewed that as an unlawful order, an order that I had a duty to challenge. So let's talk about the task force setup, was your question. But I wanted to make that distinction clear because I had a mission, and and when you're in government service, you follow your orders as long as they're lawful. And so it didn't matter that I thought the I-49 squad should have had the mission. The mission was mine, and it was in my lap, and my job was to execute it to the best of my ability. And I ran that task force for 2.5 years. And so what I did was actually modeled it after what we learned from the USS Cole, right? And so what we learned from the USS Cole attack was, and this is how we operated in that, and that was and should have been the model after 9/11. And so what we did in Yemen was, after some high-level debates, determined that when we had suspects and witnesses, the people who are trained to do interviews and interrogations are the FBI and NCIS special agents, right? In their training, the CIA, they're case officers, they're intelligence officers. Their job is to recruit assets, right? Now, that's part of the job of NCIS as well, but we're also criminal investigators. NCIS is a hybrid organization. If you watch the television show NCIS, I don't watch the show, but I think it's all about criminal investigations. But the mission of NCIS is to provide the Navy and Marine Corps with criminal investigative, counterintelligence, and counterterrorism support. And so you have those three assets of the mission. And so what we determined we would do there was that the interviews would be conducted by NCIS and the FBI because there was no reason to bring a CIA officer into the room, right? Because the questioning isn't intelligence, right? The communications, the answers may be evidence, it may be intelligence. And I often equate this to people who work with computers, say everything's a 1 or a 0, right? And so what you want to do is elicit the most data, the most information from the person you're being interviewed through an effective interviewing process, the results of that, those communications that come out, may be intelligence or evidence. And so the way that we modeled the Cole was the CIA would have access to all the data, which is the intel that they could disseminate through their mechanisms. NCIS, responsible for threat warnings to the Navy and Marine Corps, could disseminate that intelligence to the Navy and Marine Corps. And then NCIS and the FBI, as criminal investigators, can use that information as evidence in trials, which we thought would have been in the Southern District of New York.
Right.
Some of the trials happened in Yemen, but of course, during the Cole attack, we never envisioned military commissions or Guantanamo. So that was the model that should have been used, because now you avoid having untrained people in the interview room. Now you avoid having to worry about protecting the identity of any of the people, because the NCIS and FBI will testify in court, right? We don't need our identities protected. We're federal agents. We're not in covered positions, as some of the CIA personnel were. So you avoid that whole aspect of compromising your identity, and where you bring nothing to the table. You don't have training or experience that. And that's what was agreed to in the Cole investigation. And certainly within the Department of Defense, that was looked at as the model for future terrorist investigations. However, after 9/11, decisions were made out of fear, ignorance, and arrogance. And with the fury that the country had about being attacked and how vulnerable we were, unwise decisions were made, and we're still paying the price for them today.
Yes, and I think a problem, and I want to get your thoughts on this next point I'm going to raise, is because this would come back and haunt you, and this is something that you fought ardently against, was that what authorized the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. And this plan, for those who are not familiar, I'll just elucidate, was that there was a plan outlined by White House counsel lawyers John Yoo and David Addington on November 13th, 2001, which was to give the president full authority over the Justice Department regarding who could be labeled an enemy combatant, who in turn would not be afforded protection under the Geneva Convention, and that this would allow the military to detain any foreigner whom the president deems a terrorist or conspired in terrorism, and that detainees will have limited means to confront their accusers, see evidence, or be present at these trials. They allowed the CIA to conduct these torture methods hidden behind the wall of enhanced interrogation techniques. And this memorandum is so huge because it gave the authority for the CIA to conduct these terrorist methods, which basically you fought against. And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it was on the 17th of September, 2001, when the president issued it's called a memorandum of notification. On movies, it's a finding, right? Where the president it's a covert order that the president gave that allowed the CIA to establish what became the RDI program, rendition, detention, interrogation. They had some limited experience in renditions, kidnapping. They had no legitimate experience in detention operations, and they had no legitimate experience in interrogation. And so this RDI program was established. However, they didn't look to do any of the interrogations until Abu Zubaydah was captured. And when Abu Zubaydah was captured and gave information that Mukhtar, KSM, was responsible for what was called the planes operation. That's the 9/11 attack. The Cole attack was called the boats operation, right? So they had a planes operation, they had a boats operation, and so it was after FBI agents were able to elicit from Abu Zubaydah that KSM was responsible for the planes operation, that Director Tennant, CIA Director Tennant, was enraged that it was FBI agents who got that information, because he wanted the CIA to save the day. And part of why I think you wanted that, and part of why I believe he fought so hard for the mission, was to cover up the fact that they withheld information from the NCIS and FBI investigators investigating the Cole attack about the Al-Qaeda summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, because we were following the money that left Yemen with a guy named Khalid, a one-legged Al-Qaeda member. And so that information never was given to the investigators because had we got that information, we would have followed the funding. Exactly. And two of those people from that Kuala Lumpur meeting went on to San Diego for flight training. They weren't smart enough to get the flight training, so they became muscle hijackers. Yes. But you know, and you can't say, you know, you could have prevented it, but I think we really would have had a fighting chance. If you look at the manner in which that we would have conducted that investigation, there's at least a likelihood that the September 11th attacks could have been prevented had that information been shared. And that is part of the 9/11 Commission report. Right. Yeah. And so that was a serious mistake and blunder by the CIA. And you know, in my view, that cost 3,000 lives. Sure. And those two men were Khalid al-Badr and Nawaf al-Hazmi. That's correct. And now you saw the writing on the wall because you actually, you had White House officials actually visiting Guantanamo Bay. Now, in chapter 6 of your book, you do write that you, along with Ralph Blinko and Mike Gels from the behavioral science team, you actually went down to Gitmo on June 9, 2002 to try and quell the growing enthusiasm for the seer-based techniques in favor over successful report interrogation. Why was the CIA and White House so fixated on harsher torture methods, enhanced interrogation techniques, and not the successful report-building relationship that you outlined with the FBI? Yeah, there's even a little more to that story that you'd be interested in, Adam. So I was you mentioned how the president had the authority to try Al-Qaeda suspects, and he did. And the order to me said that. And so what I would have to do for any of those that were brought to trial in the early days, Hamdan and Bin Laden's bodyguard and Hicks and those others, I had to do what's called the reason to believe determination. And so our task force, our first responsibility was to conduct a preliminary investigation to determine if there is reason to believe, we call them RTBs, everything in the government's an initial, right? A reason to believe that the person that we have in custody falls under the provisions of the president's order, where the president said he could determine who goes to military commissions. And so I would have to sign an RTB and it'd go through interagency to wind up on the president's desk. And the president would say, I agree with Fallon or I don't agree with Fallon, because I signed all of them. And any ones that I signed, he did bring, you know, he did say, yes, you're right. The preliminary investigation did reveal they were a member of Al-Qaeda. And what was interesting about that was I was at the Pentagon I was talking to them about reason to believe for Ibn Sheik al-Libi. Ibn Sheik al-Libi was in custody in Bagram, and he was the emir of the Khaldan training camp. And I thought, here was a guy that would be a perfect candidate for military commissions. He was a emir of a Al-Qaeda training camp, training you know, these would-be terrorists. Well, while I was up there at that meeting, they said that a group of lawyers were going to Guantanamo to get an update on the status of the cases. And I said, wait a minute, this is actually ludicrous, because the cases and the case agents are in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, right? The investigators, while we had investigators at Gitmo, the case agents themselves were in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And I was the special agent in charge, the chief investigator for Al-Qaeda for military commissions. If you want a status and update on the cases, you come to us. You don't go to it would be like if a U.S. attorney, someone who wanted an update on a federal investigation, going to a federal prison and asking the warden what the status of the case is, right? It was so crazy to think of. I was like, what? This makes no sense. Who is going to Guantanamo? What lawyers are going to Guantanamo? And they reeled off a bunch of names I never heard of. They said Alberto Gonzalez. I'm like, who is Alberto Gonzalez? He's President Bush's lawyer. I'm like, what? David Addington. Who's David Addington? He's Dick Cheney's lawyer. I was like, what? You got to be kidding me. Who else is going? Michael Chertoff, Deputy Attorney General, said, what? I mean, they meet once a week with us about the cases. This makes no sense. Who else is going? Jim Haynes, the Office of General Counsel for Donald Rumsfeld. That's who I reported to. I'm like, this is crazy. So I said, I got to get down there. I got to get a plane. Sure. And so I ordered a plane, and Ralph Blanco didn't make that trip. He was still back at headquarters, but Mike Ellis did. And we went down, and my whole goal was to say, what are you doing? If you want an update on cases, this was September 24th, 25th of 2002. I'm the guy to get it from as the chief investigator, not General Dunleavy, who's in charge of intel, not investigations, and not General Backus, who's in charge of the prison. So, the whole thing was a ruse. And so, what my boss, Colonel Britt Mallow, he was the commander, I was the deputy commander. He said, yeah, we got to get down there. We got to derail them. And we knew that they wanted to use the same techniques that the CIA was using. And so I was going down there to say, one, that's ridiculous. That makes no sense because it's not going to elicit accurate, reliable information. You're going to get false confessions. You're going to get fabricated information. You're going to get, you're going to get garbage. It's not reliable intelligence if you do that. And I was iced out of the meetings. The generals down there would not let me meet with these people. And so that was a seminal point in my mind when I saw the most senior lawyers of the government, all who were read into the EIT, the Excuses to Inflict Torture program, that I was not, right? And so it never in my wildest imagination, Adam, was that the government would have sanctioned this. I mean, I actually, when I saw what they were doing, thought it was some rogue CIA personnel in some small unit. And I was trying to stop the Department of Defense from going down this road that I knew would result in congressional hearings. I mean, I knew, there was no way. I mean, I have my own staff of lawyers. We looked at the Convention Against Torture. We looked at the U.S. Code, looked at the Uniform Code of Military Justice. This was illegal. These were war crimes that we were going to be committing. And so I felt it was a duty to try to stop them from happening. I couldn't stop the CIA from doing what they did at black sites. However, once they came to Guantanamo, that's a Navy base. That's my jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. And so once they started getting the DOD involved, now I had a duty and obligation to try to stop that. I did it because it was my job. And so that's why I took such a hard stand, is I felt it was my responsibility as the government's chief investigator for terrorists for trial for military commission. I mean, I was trying to execute President Bush's order to bring terrorists to justice, knowing that if they went down that road, it would interfere with the president's order to bring terrorists to justice. There was no way you could torture someone and then bring them to a legitimate trial. And so I was just trying to do my job.
You, as if you didn't have enough headaches, you also mentioned in the book that you voiced with great concern about Jeffrey Miller, the commander of advanced torture at Guantanamo Bay, that he brought with him the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld's April 16, 2003 policy guidelines for Guantanamo to serve as the model for the command-wide policy he recommended they establish. What was it about Jeff? What had happened here?
Yeah, so what happened, Adam, this is the inside baseball. So General Dunleavy, Michael Dunleavy, a reservist who was a SIG-Inter, signals intelligence person, reservist, was a family court judge in Erie, Pennsylvania, wanted to utilize the SEER techniques of waterboarding against detainees. And that's who that team of lawyers met with, was Dunleavy. We were able to convince the Army leadership that Dunleavy was unbalanced. All right, he had no command decorum, no command presence. He was dangerous, in my view. And I wrote in the book that, you know, people were calling him cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. There was actually, somebody brought me a box of Cocoa Puffs in my office and it stood on my bookshelf. And if they come in the story, they just point to the Cocoa Puffs box. And I knew it was going to be a Dunleavy story about some wacky event he had. He was telling people he's number 3 on Al-Qaeda's hit list behind the president and the Secretary of Defense. He was just, he was causing problems down there. And I was able to go back to the G2 of the Army and to the General Counsel of the Army and say, listen, you know, he has a separate task force than me, right? He's responsible for intelligence. I'm responsible for criminal investigations. However, what he's doing is going to impede and corrupt my investigations if he goes on. Well, he was relieved. However, only after he sent up the request to do the SEER methodologies on DOD prisoners, and Jeffrey Miller was brought in to implement those policies. And so, unfortunately for me, I was so ecstatic that Dunleavy was relieved, and I was so happy that a Army general who was would come in, who had a great reputation, and he met with Donald Rumsfeld, and then he came down to meet with me at Fort Belvoir to give him a brief, because, you know, I didn't work for him. We had competing missions, right? His mission was to gather intelligence. My mission was to conduct criminal investigations. What they did was, when they eliminated Dunleavy, was, and there was another general down there, General Backus, an Army MP, they relieved Backus early before his tour was ended. I actually thought that I was going to be relieved as well, and Britt Mallow were going to be relieved too. I think that may have created too much of a political stink, so they didn't do it. But what they did was they combined the JTF 160 task force that General Backus had as the custodian for prisons with the JTF 170 task force, which Dunleavy had, which was to gather intelligence, so that they can create the conditions of confinement from the CIA's program. Because you had to be able to establish the conditions that created debility, dependency, and dread, is the theory of the program, right? And so if you didn't control the prison population, you couldn't do that. And so I didn't realize that. So when I first met Miller, November 25th, 27th of 2002, I think it was 27th, it was when I finally realized that the Department of Defense was going to implement a state-sponsored torture policy. And I can tell you, I was apoplectic, I was unbelievable to me. I kind of figured the CIA would get wacky, because over their years, they always did. All right, they were above the law, totally unaccountable for whatever they did. They killed people in the past, and they got away with it. So it didn't surprise me that it surprised me the depths of depravity when it finally came out in the torture report, the SISI, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report. I never envisioned the depths of depravity of the program until that came out. But it didn't surprise me that the CIA was going to get abusive, right? It shocked me that members of the military, that the Department of Defense would sanction. It's torture. I mean, it's so against the core of what our training is. And you know, we trained all of our personnel when they come into CITF, and I personally trained them, and I gave them a briefing. No one went into the box. No one did an interview interrogation until they had our training. And what we used in our training was the Nuremberg example. And we said that in Nuremberg, junior officers were tried. The defense that you were following orders is not a defense if the order is unlawful. And so we told our people is, you cannot follow an unlawful order, even if it's from us, even if it's from me. Right. You have a duty and obligation to challenge that order if it's unlawful. And so that's how instilled it was in us, you know, about obeying that and having some dignity and a code of conduct and everything else. It was so ingrained in our training, because I had been with the Department of Defense since 1981, and I left the Marshal Service to become an NCIS special agent. And had worked around the world, frankly, with CIA. You know, in the United States, NCIS coordinates their counterintelligence activities with the FBI, and overseas we do it with the CIA. I mean, I worked with them, you know, for years. I've been assigned to the Philippines. I've been assigned to Italy. I worked throughout the world, and so that was really the shocker, Adam, because the same day that I met with him, Southcom, the U.S. Southern Command, which is what Gitmo reported to, forwarded up Dunleavy's request to use the SEER techniques at Guantanamo. And so that should have been where lawyers should have stopped it, right? And the lawyers rubber stamped it. Everyone would rubber stamp it because they were told that Rumsfeld approved this stuff until I got to Alberto Mora, the General Counsel of the Navy, who finally said, actually, what he told me was, not knowing any of this was sanctioned, not knowing the president was, he said, the presidency's at stake here. He was appointed, you know, he was a Republican appointed by President Bush to be the General Counsel of the Department of the Navy. And he was like, the presidency's at stake here. We've got to stop this. If anybody finds out that we're going to be engaged in war crimes, I mean, we could lose the presidency. I mean, you know, so you know, Alberto Mora kind of restored my faith in presidential appointees. I mean, he is one of my heroes because as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I used my chains of command. You know, I went up my chain of command to the Office of Secretary of Defense, and of course, they fell on deaf ears because they were the ones who wanted to do it, right? Jim Haynes, the General Counsel, and Rumsfeld wanted to use these techniques. I went back to my Army chain of command because I was detailed to the Army, and that chain of command didn't disagree with me that it was improper, didn't disagree with our interpretation that it was unlawful, but said, we're on record opposing it, don't worry about it. I didn't feel that was enough. So I went back to my NCIS chain of command, and actually the reason I did it, Adam, was I thought we were going to kill Mohammed al-Qahtani, prisoner 63, who likely would have been the 20th hijacker on the flight that was the only flight that didn't achieve its mission, right? That didn't hit. It would have been the capital for that flight. It crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, when the passengers were able to overtake the muscle hijackers and get into the cockpit. But so I was reviewing his interrogation logs. JTF 170, JTF Gitmo did not know that I was getting access to the logs where I was reading exactly what they were doing to him and reading his medical reports. And at the same time, around this time, we are killing prisoners in Afghanistan, right? So I'm getting reports about prisoner deaths in Afghanistan. And I went to the director of NCIS and said, we've got to do something. We are about on the brink of killing a prisoner in U.S. custody at a naval installation. And the director of NCIS, Dave Brandt, went to Alberto Mora. And you know, first, and Alberto Mora said, yeah, let's meet. And that's when Ralph Blenko, Mike Ellis, and I met with Alberto Mora for the first time and laid the program out. And when he looked at the legal justification from Diane Beaver, lawyer at Guantanamo, he said, this is totally improper. This isn't even the right legal readout. It's totally wrong. They were aghast. We sit down with the most senior lawyers within the Navy Marine Corps, and none of them could believe the legal interpretation down at JTF 170 that tried to intimate that this could be somehow lawful.
The more, I think, shocking aspect was that you just thought that this would be a localized event in Cuba, but then you started noticing that the CIA was opening black sites in Poland and Iraq and Afghanistan. And you also mentioned—
I can neither confirm nor deny that.
Right. But you do mention in the book that in 2003, even the British, even the British Special Forces were complaining to their superiors about the torture methods of Americans, of detainees in Iraq at the time. I think I join you in your this is audacious on the part of the CIA, and to the extent of the White House, Bush White House, that they would be so open and so blatant in the use of torture, and then to try and defend these actions. It just boggles like the mind, like rationale. It's like beyond me, because I heard stories like Mustafa al-Hassawi, for example, that they anally raped him with a Brillo type device, and he's got to sit on a pillow in Guantanamo during his hearings. I'm like, what was the sense of all this?
Yeah, it was retribution. It was fury. We became the adversary that we feared, right? And this is what happened. We look at our failed wars, our lost wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the problem was we weren't greeted as liberators, because Jeff Miller went, and the same tactics became part of SOPs, standard operating procedures. What happened was, when they were writing the procedures for Afghanistan, they came to Guantanamo, and Guantanamo told them about the SEER methodologies. And so Carolyn Wood, an Army captain, wrote those into the SOPs for Afghanistan under the thought that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply. When she was later transferred to Iraq, where the Geneva Conventions clearly did apply, even though they really applied in Afghanistan as well. But when it was clear that we were supposed to obey the Geneva Conventions, she just took that old interrogation SOP, blew the dust off it, changed the title, changed a couple words, and implemented that. And when Jeffrey Miller went to Abu Ghraib, he actually brought, his team brought dog leashes with them. That was, and so you look at the fact that, look at the tens of thousands of people, Afghanis and Iraqis, that were subjected to this family of interrogational abuses, right? We know what it looks like from the Abu Ghraib photos, right? The photos haven't been released in the other sites, but just imagine the amount of people who saw that, whose family members were part of that. And we wonder why that we had people turn against us. At the height of our deaths in Iraq, the number one and number two reasons that foreign fighters from other countries came to the battlefield was Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And this all leads right back to Jeff Miller, and this all leads right back to the CIA coming to Guantanamo and spreading the torture program.
My final question, Mark, is what are you doing today? And what have you been doing currently? And a two-part question would be, what would you like for your book, Unjustifiable Means, to accomplish?
Yeah, well, I think, first I'll answer that one first. I think Unjustifiable Means is a leadership book. I think it's a book that anyone who's in a leadership position ought to take a look at, about kind of the challenges that you may face when you have to confront, someone above you in something that you legitimately think is wrong, right? And anyone involved, in a counterterrorism investigation operation ought to read it. It's part of American history. I mean, I wrote it because it's a story that needed to be told. Like it or not, I'm part of history, right? And so I at least wanted the public to know, because the CIA made a concerted effort to manipulate the public in the manner in which and they still do it today. And that's part of why I fight redactions. And so I think the book ought to serve for anyone who's in this capacity and needs to really lead during crisis. And the crisis could be in business world or something else when you're under different pressures, but kind of what it takes to kind of get through it. And believe me, it wasn't fun. It wasn't something I asked for, and it wasn't easy. But I got through it. It tested my mettle, and it was a professional challenge of my lifetime. But I know I stood tall, and as I said in the end of my book, I did my job. Right? I did my job. And so what I'm doing today is I still speak out loudly and proudly about my government service, about how it ought to be, about the fact that we take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Al-Qaeda took an oath to Osama bin Laden, right? They pledged bayat to people. When you're in government service, you don't. I didn't take an oath to Donald Rumsfeld, and that's what I have told them in the Pentagon when they told me torture was lawful. Donald Rumsfeld can't make law, and I didn't pledge bayat to Donald Rumsfeld. I took an oath to the Constitution of the United States of America, what is embodied in that document, what that thing stands for. And so that's what I continue to believe today. No one told me that I should no longer protect and defend the Constitution. And Roosevelt wrote a very famous speech at the Sorbonne in France. And it's not the critic that counts. Everyone talks about, marred by sweat and this, and, if you read through to the later lines in that, Roosevelt talks about the responsibilities of citizens in a republic, and how if the level that a high tide raises all boats, right? And so I think that citizens, and I encourage citizens to speak out. And so I was on a 12-person steering committee that developed the Mendez principles on effective interviewing. And it started with Juan Mendez, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. In 2016, he delivered a thematic to the United Nations, and I was a special advisor to Juan, helping them prepare that. And what that thematic said was to the UN General Assembly, and I spoke at the General Assembly in 2017 at a side event there with the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and others in the audience about what we need to do is we now have science that shows us unequivocally, and this is what we write about in the Interrogation and Torture volume of Oxford University Press. We now know that rapport-based methods do produce more accurate, reliable information, less false and fabricated information, right? When I was arguing my points back in 2001, I didn't know the science. I didn't have the science, right? I was arguing that based on my experience, right? Based on my working the Blind Sheik case, the terror stop operation, based on my career in NCIS, based on the USS Cole investigation, based on all I did, this is what I believe to be the case. This is what I feel in my heart is the case. And you have the CIA saying the same thing. We're getting good information. We just can't tell you about it because it's all classified, right? So I was fighting, the shadows. Now we have the science. And so what the Mendez principles says is that anyone who involved in interrogation ought to have training. And the training ought to be based on science, right? And there's 6 basic principles, and I could send you the details if you'd like. But right now, what we're looking for countries to do, and some are, and we're looking for bodies of the United Nations to do, is adopt the Mendez principles on effective interviewing. Because what they will do is, if employed, is ensure that what we are getting is accurate and reliable information to protect our national security and to protect the public safety, and that we will do so in adherence to universal human rights standards, because they are consistent, right? The developing of rapport is consistent with human rights standards. And even if you look at policing today, we've lost trust in policing community, right? They lost trust in police. Part of that is we're still using coercive tactics in our interrogations in the United States, right? And so we need to evolve. We need to evolve to science-based methods, and some have. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which you mentioned I was the assistant director of training of, now teaches the scientific methods. My old organization, NCIS, has come out with a policy. We will only teach, and we will, from this day forward, we will only utilize science-based methods in our interview interrogation practices. We need more agencies to do that, right? We need more people to take the lead, and you will see a trickle-down effect, because you will get more accurate, reliable information, but you will also build community trust, right? There's a lot of emphasis right now on use of force, right, and de-escalation during the arrest. Well, what happens if you're re-escalating in the interrogation room, right? It's a continuum. You need to de-escalate throughout that process, and that's why I'm so proud of what's going on in Ukraine. Is Yuri Belosov, the chief prosecutor for war crimes, is trying to implement the Mendez principles on effective interviewing to ensure that they get the best intelligence for their national security, and they get the best uncorrupted evidence for their cases, and that they avoid the pitfalls that we have at Guantanamo, where we still have yet to bring people to justice. 2 decades in the 4th administration, 4 presidential administrations, and we have yet to bring people to justice at Guantanamo Bay.
Mark Fallon, Unjustifiable Means, the inside story of how the CIA, Pentagon, and U.S. government conspired to torture. Thank you very much for coming on.
Pleasure being with you today, Adam.